Good evening, third grade families. We are almost done with Mr. Popper's Penguins. They are about to set off on their adventure to go to Seattle and start performing. We are currently on chapters 15 and 16, so they are getting on the road. Let's see what this looks like. During the next day, there was much to be done at 432 Proudfoot Avenue. There were new clothes to buy for all of them and the old ones to pack away in mothballs. Then Mrs. Popper had to scrub and polish and straighten the whole place, for she was much too good a housekeeper to leave everything in sixes and sevens while the Poppers were away. Mr. Greenbaum sent them their first week's pay in advance. The first thing they did was to pay off the man who had installed the freezing plant in the basement. He had been getting rather uneasy about his money, and after all, without him, they could have never trained the penguins. Next, they sent a check to the company who had been shipping the fresh fish all the way from the coast. At last, everything was done, and Mr. Popper turned the key in the door of the little house. They were a little late in arriving at the railway station on account of the argument with the traffic policeman. The argument was on account of the accident to the two taxi cabs with 4 poppers and 12 penguins, not to mention the 8 suitcases and pail of water with the live fish for the penguins' lunch. Mr. Popper found that they could not all fit into one cab, so he had to call a second one. Each of the taxi drivers was eager to be the first to get to the station and surprise the people there by opening the door of his cab and letting out 6 penguins. So they raced each other all the way. And in the last block, they tried to pass each other, and one of the fenders got torn off. The traffic officer naturally got very much annoyed. The train was about to pull out of the station when they arrived. Even with both taxi drivers helping them through the gate and over the brass rails onto the real observation platform, they barely made it. The penguins were gasping. It had been decided that Mr. Popper should ride in the baggage car with the penguins to keep them from getting nervous, while Mrs. Popper and the children should ride in one of the Pullmans. Because of getting on at the observation end of the train, Mr. Popper had to take the birds through the whole length of the train. It was easy enough to get them through the club car, even with the pail of fish to carry. In the sleeping cars, however, where the porter was already making up some of the berths, where there was trouble. The porter's ladders offered too much temptation to the penguins. There were a dozen happy orcs from a dozen ecstatic beaks. Poppers performing penguins, completely forgetting their discipline, fought to climb the ladders and get into the upper berths. Poor Mr. Popper, one lady screamed that she was going to get off the train, whether it was going 90 miles an hour or not. A gentleman wearing a clergyman's collar suggested opening a window so the penguins could jump out. 2 porters tried to shoo the birds out of the berths. Finally, the conductor and the brakeman with a lantern came to the rescue. It was quite a while before Mr. Popper got his pets safely into the baggage car. Mrs. Popper worried a little at the start over the idea of having Janie and Bill miss 10 weeks of school while they were on the road, though the children did not seem to mind. "And you must remember, my love," said Mr. Popper, who had never before been out of Stillwater, in spite of his dreams of distant countries, "travel is very broadening." Oh, and here's the penguins trying to crawl into bed with the people. From the start, the penguins were a riotous success. Even their opening performance in Seattle went off without a hitch, probably because they had already rehearsed on a real stage. It was here that the penguins added a little novelty number of their own to the program. They were the first thing on the bill. When they finished their regular act, the audience went wild. They clapped and stomped and roared for more of Popper's performing penguins. Janie and Bill helped their father herd the penguins off the stage so the next act could go on. This next act was a tightrope walker named Monsieur Duval. The trouble was that instead of watching him from the wings, as they should have done, the penguins got interested and walked out on the stage again to watch him more closely. Unfortunately, at this moment, Monsieur Duval was doing a very difficult dance on the wire overhead. The audience, of course, had thought that the penguins were all through and were very pleased to see them return and line up with their backs to the audience and look up at Monsieur Duval, dancing so carefully on the wire high above them. This made everyone laugh so hard that Monsieur Duval lost his balance. "Ork," said the penguins, waddling away hurriedly in order not to be under him when he fell, cleverly recovering his balance. Monsieur Duval caught the wire by the inside of his elbow and saved himself. He was very angry when he saw the pauper performing penguins opening wide their 12 red beaks as if they were laughing at him. "Go away, you stupid things," he said to them in French. "Ork," said the penguins, pretending not to understand and making remarks to each other in penguin language about Monsieur Duval. And whenever they appeared, the more they interfered with the other acts on the program, the better the audiences liked them. Fame. The birds soon became so famous that whenever it was known that the pauper performing penguins were to appear at any theater, the crowds would stand in line half a mile down the street, waiting their turn to buy tickets. The other actors on the program were not always so pleased, however. Once, in Minneapolis, a celebrated lady opera singer got very much annoyed when she heard that the pauper penguins were to appear on the same program. In fact, she refused to go on stage unless the penguins were put away. So the stage hands helped Mr. and Mrs. Pauper and the children get the birds off the stage and downstairs to a basement under the stage, while the manager guarded the stage entrance to make sure that the penguins did not get past. But down in the basement, the birds soon discovered another little flight of steps going up. And in another minute, the audience was shrieking with laughter as the penguins' heads suddenly appeared, one by one, in the orchestra pit, where the musicians were playing. The musicians kept on playing, and the lady on the stage, when she saw the penguins, sang all the louder to show how angry she was. The audience was laughing so hard that nobody could hear the words of her song. Mr. Pauper, who had followed the penguins up the stairs, stopped when he saw that it led to the orchestra pit. "I don't think I'm supposed to go up there with the musicians," he told Mrs. Pauper. "The penguins did," said Mrs. Pauper. "Papa, you'd better get them off before they start biting the pegs and strings off the fiddle," said Bill. "Oh dear, I just don't know what to do," said Mr. Pauper, sitting down helplessly on the top step. "Then I will catch the penguins," said Mrs. Pauper, climbing up past him with Janie and Bill following. When they saw Mrs. Pauper coming after them, the penguins felt very guilty because they knew they did not belong there. So they jumped up on the stage, ran over the footlights, and hid under the singing lady's blue skirt. That stopped the singing entirely, except for one high, shrill note that had not been written into the music. The birds loved the bright lights of the theater and the great laughing audiences and all the traveling. There was always something new to see. From Stillwater out to the Pacific Ocean they traveled. It was a long way now to the little house at 432 Proudfoot Avenue, where the Paupers had to worry about whether their money would hold out until spring. And every week they got a check for $5,000. When they were not actually playing in some theater or traveling on trains between cities, their life was spent in the larger hotels. Now and then a startled hotel keeper would object to having their birds registered there. "Why, we don't even allow lapdogs in this hotel," they would say. "Yes, but do you have any rule against penguins?" Mr. Pauper would ask. Then the hotel keeper would have to admit there was no rule about penguins. And of course, when he saw how neat the penguins were and how other guests came to his hotel in the hope of seeing them, he was very glad to have them. You might think that a large hotel would offer a great many opportunities for mischief to a lot of penguins, but they behaved very well, on the whole, never doing anything worse than riding up and down too often in the elevators and occasionally biting the brass buttons off of some bellboys' uniforms. $3,000 a week may sound like a great deal of money, and yet the Poppers were far from rich. It was quite expensive to live in grand hotels and travel about town in taxicabs. Mr. Popper often thought that the Penguins could just as well have walked back and forth between hotels and theaters, but every one of their walks looked so much like a parade that it always tied up the traffic. So Mr. Popper, who never liked to be a nuisance to anyone, always took taxis instead. It was expensive to have huge cakes of ice brought up to their hotel rooms to cool the Penguins. The bills in the fine restaurants where the Poppers often took their meals were often dreadfully high. Fortunately, however, the Penguins' food had stopped being an expense to them. On the road, they had to give up having tank cars of live fish shipped to them because it was so hard to get deliveries on time. So they went back to feeding the birds on canned shrimps. This cost them absolutely nothing, for Mr. Popper had written a testimonial saying, "Poppers performing penguins thrive on Owen's Oceanic Shrimp." The statement, with a picture of the 12 penguins, was printed in all the leading magazines, and the Owen's Oceanic Shrimp Company gave Mr. Popper an order that was good for free cans of shrimp at any grocery store, anywhere in the country. Several other companies, such as the Great Western Spinach Growers Association and the Energetic Breakfast Oats Company, wanted him to recommend their product too and offered him large sums of cash. But the Penguins simply refused to eat spinach or oats, and Mr. Popper was much too honest to say they would, even though the money would have came in handy. From the Pacific coast, they turned east again to cross the continent. They had time enough on their brief tour to touch only the larger cities. After Minneapolis, they played Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. Wherever they went, their reputation traveled ahead of them. When early in April, they reached Boston. Huge crowds awaited them in the railway station. Up to now, it had not been difficult to keep the Penguins comfortable, but a warm spring wind was blowing across Boston Common, and at the hotel, Mr. Popper had to have the ice brought up to his rooms in 1,000-pound cakes. He was glad that the 10-week contract was almost up, and that the next week, when his birds were to appear in New York, was the last. Already, Mr. Greenbaum was writing about a new contract. Mr. Popper was beginning to think, however, that he had better be getting back to Stillwater, for the Penguins were growing irritable. Well, that's it tonight, my friends. We only have 3 more chapters to go. The next one's called April Winds. I can't wait to see what they're about. All right, good night. Love you guys.